Thanks, Bridget, and a very good afternoon to all of you. Thank you, first of all, for making the time to come and hear me this afternoon. I hope you've all had a good day. I'm Chris Stevens. I'm a HMI. I work for Ofsted, a music lead. And this afternoon, I'm going to be talking about aspects of the curriculum with a particular focus on pupils with SEND and pupils who may be in specialist settings. And then, as Bridget said, we've got lots and lots of time at the end of this presentation today for any questions that you may have. And thank you in advance for the questions that many of you have sent in prior to me giving this presentation today. Hopefully, lots of those will be addressed actually as I go through the presentation. And there'll be messages that for some of you are very familiar. You will have heard me no doubt mention them before. So I'm just going to share my presentation with you and we'll make a start. Okay, so I always say this at this point, and it is meant to be helpful, these presentations. What they aren't, and what I never intend to do, is go about giving you the answers to what you should do in a Ofsted inspection. That's not the purpose of our sessions. What they aim to do is give you some what's meant to be helpful guidance about things you might want to consider as you develop and improve the music education in your particular school. So just to make it clear, it's not prescriptive, it's here to reassure. And what I will be doing throughout the presentation is drawing on published materials. So those published materials I draw heavily on today will be the Ofsted Research Review. I'm sure that colleagues in Music Mark will be able to drop that into the chat, and the Ofsted Subject Report. Documents I've referenced before, but documents again I'll be referencing today. So it's there, it's published, and should be helpful to you should you want to focus on anything or any particular aspect of what I say today. So as I've said, today's presentation will focus on the curriculum with a particular focus on pupils with SEND in both mainstream and specialist settings, and then we'll have time for questions. Now, before we get going, one of the key messages in our school inspection handbook, and that's a really helpful document as well, because something I like to remind people of when I give these presentations is that Ofsted inspects the school curriculum. Ofsted does not inspect separate subjects. Now, worth saying that again, we don't inspect separate subjects, we inspect the school's curriculum. And the guidance that inspectors follow is set out in the school inspection handbook, and that's downloadable. You can get that off our website. It's very easy to get hold of. And what that handbook says is that all parts of the education inspection framework apply to state-funded and non-maintained special schools provision, PRUs, alternative provision, and mainstream schools provision for pupils with SEND. So what I'm saying there is that handbook makes clear that the education inspection framework, the way that inspectors evaluate the quality of education in schools, similarly applies to special schools and to pupils with SEND in maintained schools. However, and you'll see in this presentation today, as with all provision, SEND provision, pupils with SEND, has some specific factors that should be taken into account, and I'm going to reflect on those today. Now, it's such an interesting topic, this, because it allows us to revisit some of the key messages from our report and from our research review, because I'm coming back to that point that the same principles apply in the handbook to special schools as well as maintained schools. So it's worth revisiting some of those key principles together today before we look specifically at special schools. So I want to share with you some of the key messages from that handbook and also share with you what our subject report found. And again, this may be helpful to you as you consider your own curriculum and you reflect on it and its effectiveness. So when inspectors evaluate the curriculum, making that point that it's the curriculum they evaluate, not individual subjects, this is what they will evaluate. One of the things that they'll reflect on: the extent to which the school's curriculum, and I'll just give you a moment to read that, it says, is planned and sequenced so that the endpoints, which I've put in bold, that is, it is building towards, are clear, and that pupils develop the knowledge and skills building on, which I've also put in bold, building on what has been taught before to be able to reach these endpoints. Now, it's a simple statement, but it talks about one of the things that inspectors will want to consider. Now, one of the great questions that somebody put before this session, they'd sent, what questions will inspectors ask us when we do a deep dive, or what inspection questions will be asked? There isn't a list of questions, but what we do know is that inspectors will be interested to know the extent to which your curriculum has clear endpoints and is logically sequenced so that knowledge is built on, or skills are built on, bit by bit. So there might be a lot of questions they could ask about that, but that's what they want to try and find out. So that's the principle. Now, when we have a look at what our music report said about that, this was a key finding related to the music curriculums in schools that we visited in regards to endpoints, the clarity of those endpoints, and whether the curriculum builds iteratively, if you like, bit by bit over time. Now, what our report found, and I think this is a really interesting thing to reflect on, is that in most schools, leaders articulated broad principles and broad curriculum aims without putting sufficient thought into the detail that would allow these principles to be realized. So, put another way, you could say that the endpoints, what the curriculum was building to, lacked clarity. In most cases, it was unclear about what the curriculum was actually building towards. There was no doubt that the schools we visited wanted pupils to develop a love and a passion for the subject. There's no doubt about that. And our evidence identifies that music was stronger and pupils ultimately achieved more, if you like, became more musical in primary and secondary schools where leaders had gone beyond broad curriculum aims. What do I mean by a broad curriculum aim? It might be something as simple as we want children to enjoy music, or we want children to appreciate music, really broad. Where schools had gone beyond that into specific endpoints, where leaders had identified specific endpoints and the building blocks of knowledge and skills that they wanted pupils to achieve in order to get to those specific endpoints, children were likely to achieve more musically. So there's a couple of words I throw into the mix here. The curriculum being deliberately planned, not happening by chance. And secondly, those endpoints being really specific. What is it? And here's a good question to ask yourselves, actually, not from an Ofsted perspective, but for your own thinking and your own development. Asking yourself, what is it that children will actually be able to do and know as a result of learning our curriculum in this school in music? What is it in our context that children will be able to know and do? That's a simple question, but it's a really difficult question. And then what are the blocks? What things do children need to learn in order to get there? Now, our music report, hopefully, helpfully, sets out some ways that some schools have done that. And you'll have heard me talk before about what some of those endpoints might look like. But if I may share an example with you to illustrate the sort of clarity I'm talking about, a school that I visited as part of the work had thought really carefully about how they wanted pupils to sing by the time they left year six. What repertoire, what technical aspects of singing, what range did they want the pupils to get to by the time they'd left? They'd thought about those things really clearly, and then had planned as part of their curriculum the building blocks that were going to get there, whether that was technique developing over time, whether that was their understanding of musical expression. But that clarity about the specifics that children would be able to know and do was really clear, as opposed to perhaps some schools where those broad aims, those well-intentioned broad aims, means that it wasn't always clear what children would be able to do and know as a result of that curriculum. So that's a principle. I'm just going to go back a slide here to just remind you of what inspectors are evaluating. They'll be evaluating whether those endpoints are clear and that pupils develop the knowledge and skills they need building on what they've done before. That is the extent to which inspectors will be looking. And those are the sort of questions, the questions they'll ask will be wanting them to understand that. Tell me what your curriculum builds towards. Help me understand how your curriculum builds over time so that pupils move towards that end point. And of course, it'll be different in different contexts, in different schools. You've heard me talk before, depending, say, if you're teaching pupils to develop some proficiency on the keyboard, those building blocks will look very different, won't they, to, say, children that are learning to become more proficient on the recorder, different technique. So that's one of the things that we evaluate. And that's what our music report had found. So hopefully a helpful reflection. A second bullet point that I've pulled out of the school inspection handbook is also to do with the curriculum. What will inspectors evaluate? Now, this is paragraph 243 of the school inspection handbook. And the reason I say that, if you get a copy of that handbook, you download it, there's a section around paragraph 243 that talks about all the things that inspectors will evaluate as part of their inspection of the school. And this bullet point reads, the extent to which the school's curriculum is ambitious, which I've put in bold, more about that in a minute, and designed to give pupils, particularly disadvantaged pupils, so that includes pupils with special educational needs and or disabilities, the knowledge they need to take advantage of opportunities, responsibilities and experiences later in life. In a nutshell, that second part of the sentence is saying they're well prepared for their next stages of learning, whatever that might be for the young person, what the children we're talking about. Now, the reason I've put in bold ambitious and designed, we've already touched on designed, this idea that it deliberately builds pupils' knowledge over time. Interestingly, one of the findings of the music report was that in secondary schools, uh, typically in secondary schools, the music curriculum was organised into termly or half-termly blocks. And by the way, I'm not making any judgment about that. I'm just saying that's what we found, that they were mostly typically organised into blocks of a term or half term. And what we found that was so interesting is within those blocks, individual blocks, say there's 9 of them, leaders had often considered what progress might look like within a block. So it was designed within the block, if you like, to incrementally build pupils' skills. But fewer schools had considered how musical progression might work across the whole key stage. So if you like, they'd got clear endpoints for each block, but were less clear about how those individual bits built towards the endpoint for the whole curriculum. So that designed, that idea of the deliberately, not leaving things to chance, deliberately building pupils' technical skills of music, their knowledge of music, their skills. And the reason I put ambitious in bold is if we turn to what ambition means in the context of music education, I just want to share with you the main finding, one of our main findings from the music report related to ambition. So in many schools, when considering the curriculum, leaders' thinking focused on giving pupils a range of musical opportunities. In these schools, leaders often associated ambition with the range of activities on offer. So in other words, the curriculum, even though leaders thought it was ambitious because children were doing lots of musical things, it didn't actually, in terms of building pupils' musical knowledge and skills, their development, it wasn't ambitious. People had often associated doing lots of things with a curriculum being ambitious. Ambitious in this context means actually the curriculum deliberately and incrementally builds pupils' musical knowledge and skills. That's where the ambition is. And actually, if you go back to the national curriculum, it's quite clear when you look at some of the terms in the national curriculum document, it talks about effectively getting better at, more skilled at, more nuance. It's that's where the ambition lies, not in the range of activities on offer. So our research had found that fewer schools had considered ambition in terms of incrementally developing pupils' musical knowledge and skills. And in those schools, they'd crucially considered ambition in terms of pupils' musical development rather than just the range of musical opportunities on offer. And the schools that were successful, and what do I mean by successful? These are the schools where children were left being able to do far more than when they started. They were more musical, if you like, focused on deliberately teaching pupils to get better at music rather than assuming they would get better by simply doing it. So we're back to that idea of deliberateness. And if we remember from my previous slide, one of the things inspectors will consider is to what extent is the curriculum ambitious and to what extent is it deliberately designed to prepare pupils for their next steps. So while these stronger examples were in the minority, what our research did show, and I hope this is the reason, lots of you join associations like this because you're keen, you want to develop your music curriculum to be able to do these things. We found that many schools were starting to make good use of non-statutory guidance available to them, like the Model Music Curriculum, the Ofsted Research Review, to help them with this aspect of their curriculum design, this deliberately designing. Which means I can pick up another question here, which I know is a common one that's asked at this stage. Should schools be following the Model Music Curriculum? What does Ofsted expect? Well, I hope you can see from my previous slide, inspectors will evaluate the ambition and the design. They have no view on whether that's a published scheme or not. That's up to schools to decide. We don't have a view on that. But the things we evaluate will be its ambition, its design, and as I said previously, how clear those endpoints are. That's what we evaluate. What we don't do is have a view on the model music curriculum, whether schools should or shouldn't be doing it. So hopefully that's helpful to you. Now, all of those things I've talked about, endpoints and ambition, they sort of filtered their way through the music report, striking the right note, to a couple of things that were recommendations for schools to do. And you can see, hopefully, how these music recommendations relate to the way inspectors evaluate the curriculum overall. There's a clear link, I hope. And there were several recommendations, but the two I want to draw your attention to are the curriculum identifies precise endpoints in performance. So schools should make sure that the curriculum identifies precise endpoints in performance, composition, and listening work. And the word there, precise. So not that vague. It's more helpful for schools to be really clear about what young people will be able to do and know within performance, composition, and listening, and then sets out the broad steps, the step-by-step point to reach those endpoints, that deliberately designing to reach those endpoints. And then the second bullet point, the second recommendation, is that schools should make sure that the curriculum builds incrementally, iteratively, if you like, pupils' knowledge of the technical, how to, and the constructive aspects of music. It's that deliberate bit. And that second bullet point relates directly to ambition. So I hope I've made the point here that ambition in these terms isn't the range of musical opportunities on offer. Ambition is to do with whether those opportunities help pupils to incrementally become better at controlling sound, if you like, and using sound to create music. That's the distinction. So those were our recommendations. And I said at the start of the presentation, the reason I wanted to revisit those, they're really key points for you to consider when you think about your own curriculum. But also, I started this presentation by saying in special schools, these principles, the principles of the EAF, still apply. But there are specific considerations in SEND specialist settings. And I know we've got some people on the call that may well be music leads in special schools. So I want to turn now to thinking about music, the curriculum in both mainstream and specialist settings, pupils with SEND. So there's the point I started the presentation with, the principles that I just shared, not the examples, but the principles about curriculum and how we evaluate that curriculum apply in all schools. But it does go on to say, this quote, however, as with all provision, SEND provision has some specific factors that should be taken into account. Now, for those colleagues here who don't work in specialist settings, I still think this is really interesting for you to have a perspective on and understanding, because it may help you in your own curriculum thinking about those principles. So pupils with SEND, special educational needs and disabilities, have a range of different needs and different starting points. Pupils will have unique individual needs, even where their needs may fall under the same umbrella term, such as autism. Some pupils have severe, complex, or profound needs that have a significant impact on their cognitive development, especially the way they're able to make alterations to their long-term memory. Other pupils have starting points at least as high as other pupils of their age. For instance, some pupils with sensory impairments. So the point I'm making there, that in special schools, those pupils will have very different needs. And because those pupils have very different needs, and the endpoints for the curriculum for those young people will need to look very different. All parts, as I said, of the education inspection framework apply to special schools, PRUs and other alternative provision. And while accepting that the curriculum may be very specialised, we have to accept that in those contexts, the curriculum may be very specialised indeed. And it's for this reason, on graded inspections of special schools, deep dive areas may not be traditional subject areas such as music. So let me just step back and explain why that's the case. And I want to give you an example, if I may. A school where I recently inspected, children there had profound and complex learning needs. Some of them also had some severe medical needs as well. Now, the school was still ambitious for those young people. I'm coming back to that idea of ambition, because for many of those young people, their ambition was for those young people to be able to start to make, because of their cognitive and their profound learning needs, independent choices themselves for some of the young people there, so that they were able to live more independent lives. Some of those young people in that school were very unlikely to ever lead fully independent lives. They were always going to need some support. But in that context, the ambition, and the school was incredibly ambitious for them, was to get those young people to be more independent. And that linked directly to the things in their education, health and care plans. So in that school, the things that were ambitious for that young person, it would have been inappropriate to look at traditional subject areas, because actually the provision that was in place for the young people in that school, for some of them, was very, very tailored to their particular needs in order, and if I went back to that other slide, to prepare them well for the next steps of their particular lives. And it's for that reason that when the lead inspector calls a school to announce an inspection in a specialist provision, they'll always want to understand the school's curriculum, its design during the initial phone call. And the lead inspector, once they've understood the school's curriculum design, will then decide the areas for a deep dive, or in some cases, it won't be a deep dive because it won't be appropriate because of the particular needs of the young people. So this may include, for example, national curriculum subjects, it may, but it may derive actually from the four broad areas of need, which you'll be familiar with, such as communication and interaction, or their physical development. So in that school I was talking about, one of the areas that we were looking at was what the school was doing to develop pupils' communication and language. So it was a non-national curriculum subject. Inspectors will work closely with staff in those settings to understand how the curriculum area they are looking at is designed and implemented to meet the needs of pupils in that provision. Now, I'm going to give you another example here to illustrate, I think, a broader point about curriculum design, going back to ambition and going back to endpoints. I also inspected a school where pupils had visual impairments and many of them were registered to be blind. Now, the school in that sense, many of the children in that school had similar starting points, if not higher in music, than other pupils of the same age. In fact, there was a great range of pupils with perfect pitch. It's the school I've gone to where I have to say the number of pupils with perfect pitch was higher than any other school I've been into. Those leaders were ambitious for those young people. They knew their starting points, and they designed a curriculum with those in mind to ensure that by the time pupils left, many of them who'd gone on to study music were well prepared for their next steps in that context. So I think the broader point here I'm making is that the endpoints that inspectors will evaluate will differ depending on the specific needs of the young people in that setting, and that's quite right. So I think sometimes people worry that in specialist settings, oh, will there be a deep dive in music? Not if it's not appropriate to the setting and the needs of the young people. And here, I said there are specific considerations that inspectors will consider in specialist settings, and these are those considerations. And you'll see there's a link to the ones I shared previously with you. So, firstly, whether leaders are suitably ambitious for pupils with SEND. Ambitious, it means, as we've talked before, incremental, developmental, but what that looks like for individual pupils will look very different depending on their needs. Secondly, how well leaders ensure that the curriculum is coherently sequenced, same principle, deliberately designed to meet pupils' needs, particularly their starting points and their aspirations for the future. third bullet point, how well leaders include pupils with SEND in all aspects of school life. That is something inspectors will be really interested in mainstream schools with pupils with SEND. How does the school ensure that those pupils are fully included, including as part of that in the music activities that are on offer? To what extent are pupils with SEND fully included in the school's offer? And finally, the bullet point, how well leaders ensure that pupils' outcomes are improving as a result of any different or additional provision made for them. Now, outcomes here, I just want to stress this point, that covers outcomes in communication and interaction, outcomes in cognition and learning, outcomes in physical health and development, and outcomes in social, emotional, mental health. It's outcomes in its broadest sense. How is that school curriculum helping pupils to get better in those areas? So, in summary of that, and the reason I was really keen to touch on it with you today is I know we've got colleagues from specialist provisions, and I hope you found this message reassuring. Actually, the principles of the education inspection framework apply in all schools, but there are specific considerations depending on the pupil's individual needs and the needs of the pupils that will affect the way that inspectors, the things that they evaluate and they consider. And that in some settings, specialist settings, it may be appropriate to have a deep dive with a specific focus on music. In other settings, it won't be. But the principle about clear endpoints, the principle about deliberately and incrementally building pupils' knowledge and skills still applies. So that brings me to the end of my presentation today. I hope that's been helpful to you.